Today, we're going to be speaking with David Pepper, who's the former chair of the Ohio Democratic Party, teaches election law at University of Cincinnati Law School, and is also author of the book Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. It's really great having you on, David.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So, yeah, I think maybe to start with, there's so many different places where we could look and talk about autocracy, authoritarian tendencies, and beyond. Sometimes people talk about voter disenfranchisement and suppression techniques at the state level. We obviously have this big national story of the multi-pronged effort to take an election that they didn't actually win in November of 2020. There's all these different things, control
Right.
of school curricula. I mean, when you look at autocracy, what are the most concerning kind of bullet points that you start with?
So I'd say my biggest concern is that we focus on some of the most prominent people like Trump, and we should. But my biggest worry is the other side that has, some of the players have been at this for a long time. And while we focus on the high profile people and the things that make a lot of noise and the bright, shiny objects like Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're focused on the institutions that either support democracy or, if weakened, could usher in, the lack of democracy or ultimately something that I think is referred to often as competitive autocracy. And the reason I wrote the book is to say, it reminds me of the movie Don't Look Up, which I was at first afraid to watch, but then glad I did. It's saying, don't only look at Washington. The institutions that shape our democracy in so many ways are states. One side figured that out a long time ago. They have a minority view that can only survive in a world without robust democracy. So they've had their eye and tentacles on the states for a long time, and they're converting them into, as I described, laboratories of autocracy that are nonstop undermining key, principles and tenets and protections for democracy, and it's accelerating. And so it's sort of look at the institutions. Don't just look at our usual politics, which is, federal majorities, one through swing districts and swing states. Look at the institutions that shape democracy. Those are largely state houses. Yes, the federal government can do important things to protect against those. They must. But the heart of it is at the state level. And I just think one side has been blind to that for a generation. The other side has been focused on it like a laser and are scoring victory after victory because of that.
So competitive autocracy, competitive authoritarianism, that's a term I've used with my audience before. This is important to understand. This is that you have at least, I say in theory, but maybe some people would say in principle, democratic institutions and electoral competition, but it's not really fair competition. Is that
Correct.
generally the gist of it?
Yeah, it's rigging things in advance. It's minority rule locked in with a veneer of legitimacy, with the illusion that everything was fair and up for grabs. And it sounds very sort of that's quite an accusation, but we know what it looks like. It looks like Hungary, and so we make this accusation. It's not really rebuttable anymore because they're all going to Hungary celebrating it in the wide open. Tucker Carlson, CPAC, Trump, endorsing Orban. They're not hiding that the competitive autocracy system that we see in other countries is that what they want when they embrace Hungary. And as I go through the book, almost every element that Hungary is going through, rigging legislative elections, suppressing votes in the opposition party, attacking courts, almost every element that Hungary, go through the checklist is going through, you could overlay into state house after state house in our country. It's the same pattern. So it's not like they're only celebrating it in 2022. It's either they've been modeling off of it or just doing the same thing on their own for years. And so, yeah, it is the model. And that's why I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is not simply to say, here are the elements of it that we should be concerned about, but we have to move away from doing things that unintentionally legitimize it all. And when we're too silent, when we treat it as politics as normal by allowing the filibuster to stop us from stopping it, by treating it like any other issue, we play into the competitive autocracy end goal, which is not only to sort of suppress democracy, but to make everyone think that it actually still is there in a viable way. So,
Right. That's the key
what,
point, right?
yeah,
Because
it's
if
they need to
people
seem legitimate.
if people believe it's legitimate, they are less likely to rise up against it.
Correct. And it sustains for much longer. Again, what is not an effective competitive autocracy? Storming a building. That was not what you do. That was literally, I'm sure Orban was like, no, that does not look legitimate. The key to my success is not openly, trying to overturn an election. It's actually just subtly predetermined outcomes. Everyone votes and you wipe your hands and say, hey, look, election happened. I won again for the 10th time, even though I'm in the minority. So that's why I think and some may not like this, but that's why I thought it was good when those Texas legislators left Texas.
Mm.
They were declaring this illegitimate. You don't normally leave your state. I wouldn't recommend that. But if something is so illegitimate that if you just sit there and vote no and it passes, the voters may think, well, that's just politics as normal. It's reaching a point where I think people who are fighting for democracy have to call this out. And that's why, to me, the Senate needs to keep amping it up. Joe Biden can't go silent again. If we have to force Chuck Grassley and Josh Hawley and Cruz to debate for 2 weeks on end to stop our votes to protect democracy, great, make them do it. Because competitive autocracy relies on a sense that it's legitimate and normal. We know it's not, but I think too rarely do we actually act in that way, which is allowing it to continue.
So one of the discussions that I often have with people who watch my show, or with other guests or whoever really is, to what extent do you focus on changing the system versus using the system to our advantage? And the prototypical example is the gerrymandering redistricting, which is
Right.
obviously I would rather, and many of the people in my audience would rather, a system to prevent gerrymandering to begin with, whether it's a nonpartisan redistricting commission, whatever the way it is, you prevent the problem. But until that
Right.
happens, is there any choice but to take every opportunity to gerrymander for your side, because otherwise they're going to gerrymander? How do you strike this balance? And is it
That's
a
a great
balance? Yeah.
question. Yeah, I mean, gerrymandering is bad no matter what. I try and show in the book, and I go through, so my book, one way to think about it, I do hope everyone gets it because no interview can sort of get into the details.
Sure.
And I wrote it to be read and shared because I'm so alarmed. But think of my book as sort of what's the matter with Kansas, with a lot of focus on Ohio, but the point is about democracy itself. And I walk through that once you have the non-democratic world of gerrymandering, where no one's accountable, and this is going to be true for anyone who does it, although they do a lot worse than we do. This is not a both sides issue.
Yep.
Public outcomes crater in these non-democratic rigged state houses because the incentives that we normally expect on politicians in a democracy, good public outcomes, don't be corrupt, all the incentives that come with the accountability of democracy disappear in these rigged systems. So Ohio, under this terribly rigged non-democratic state house, has seen our public education fail, our healthcare outcomes in the low 40s, highest level of student debt in the country. So no one should be stuck in a state house with no democracy. It's just bad. But to your point, there's going to be a natural race to the bottom if one side sees one doing it, especially on the congressional level. And if they don't do it, then they lose power. And this is why it doesn't have to be either or. This is why the federal legislation that would provide guardrails for everybody is so important. And I want everything there to pass, but the legislation in the Freedom to Vote Act would basically come up with some rules about what an unconstitutional gerrymander looks like, or an illegal gerrymander under federal law. It may not be deemed unconstitutional, but it could be deemed illegal. That would basically say whatever state you are, there are certain rules you have to follow or you're violating the law. And the Congress has the right to do that. That's the best way to avoid what you talked about. Change the system, add guardrails, and don't put any state in a position that it's creating basically a lack of democracy and all the terrible results that come. And by the way, in Ohio, we did pass 2 constitutional amendments. We elected a fair Supreme Court. we showed in the last couple of weeks that a court will uphold fair rules if you have them in place. And that's why the court struck down a really bad map here. That's a win for democracy, the best in the last generation in Ohio. But it shows that that federal legislation could do the same thing. So there's a way to avoid that terrible choice by establishing rules that everyone has to follow.
Many in our audience understand and are aware of the push to privatization that exists in a number of different areas in society. In the book, you talk about how a lot of that is actually happening thanks to state legislatures. Can you give a
Yes.
couple examples of that? Because I think oftentimes the assumption is that it's happening as a result of things that politicians in Washington, D.C. are doing.
No, so the big private players have figured out over the last 20 years to get the worst, hairiest, most unpopular, and most inconsistent with public outcomes parts of their agenda done, you go to the state houses. That's where you do it because no one's paying attention. These people are rigged so they can never lose their election, even when we do really stupid and horrible things. And so examples of that in Ohio, they drained public schools of funding for a generation to give it to for-profit charter school online outfits, some of which have been total scams. And the politicians, even though the schools in their own backyards are plummeting and have less money, and the public and the private players they've helped, who've given them money the whole time, have literally turned into scandals. They've only won because of it. They've never lost. So that's a great example. In Ohio, we've been draining money. The state house, has been pulling money out of local governments for a decade to give it out as tax cuts at the high end. The entire trickle-down theory is in play in almost every state. Again, it would not be sustainable. The shape of small towns and school districts is collapsing. It wouldn't be sustainable in a normal democracy because the results are indefensible. But in this rigged world where they can't lose, these players have figured out you couldn't get it done in Washington. It's too hard. But it get coverage in a way that would be a problem.
Right.
But that Betsy DeVos agenda, a state house will do it without thinking twice. And for the most part, no one even knows. And there are examples all over the country. And in one of my pieces of advice in my book to anyone running, don't talk about most of what we're talking about right now in your 30-second general election ad. Find the public outcome that is the most horrific. In Kansas, it was the fact that they had school 4 days a week.
Right.
And Laura Kelly won on that issue. She could have said anything in the world about Chris Kobach that a lot of Democrats might have said, we agree. But she was smart enough to say the true issue where I can explain the impact of this corruption and this privatization of everything at the state level and how it impacts public outcomes people care about. The best example is school 4 days a week. In Texas, it's an energy grid collapsing so that people froze to death a year ago. And Beto O'Rourke is doing a great job on that, focusing on that. We have to translate the corrosion of the public asset and public good and the common good is endemic to these broken, privatized state houses. And we have to be smart enough to not just, run around saying the sky is falling, although it arguably is falling quickly, is to say, the reason you, everyday voters, should care about this is your town and your school and your roads and everything else are in worse shape because the Koch brothers have essentially taken over your state house.
In the in the just minute we have left, other than registering to vote and voting in every election where you can vote, what's the low-hanging fruit that people in the audience should be doing?
It's go broader and then registering, although that's a very important part of it in states like Georgia and Ohio. Think about your footprint that you have of influence and think about all the ways that you can use that footprint to lift democracy. And it's bigger than you imagine. If you're on the board of a homeless shelter, is the homeless shelter engaging those it serves, or a food bank? Do you know the mayor of a town? Are they registering voters in their rec centers, in their libraries? Scale it up. If you run a small business, is part of your mission of that business, lift democracy. And again, it's registration, it's engagement once people are registered, it's early vote. Just think, literally sit down and write down, what's my footprint? And I go through all the details in the book and engage that footprint as much as you can to lift democracy. And that includes helping people run for state office, state house office, board of education, you name it, registering. but use your footprint. Don't wait for Stacey Abrams to save the day or Michelle Obama. Don't just assume people are going to get registered to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Use the things you do every day to also lift democracy. And that's the way I think we start hitting a scale, especially when we know that every single day the other side is attacking those same voters and
Right.
attacking democracy. So if you're not doing this stuff, we're not just holding steady, we're losing ground in a lot of these states.
Without a doubt. The book is Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. We've been speaking with the book's author, David Pepper. David, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Great talking to you. Thanks for all you talk about every day.